My friends, settle in, dim the lights. Forget everything you think you know about the beginning of civilization, because tonight we are going deeper than the history books dare to go.
We talk about ancient history, and our minds instantly jump to the colossal achievements we've been taught to revere. The Great Pyramids of Giza, monuments that scrape the clouds and stand as testaments to pharaonic power, roughly 4,500 years old. We think of Stonehenge, that mysterious ring of sarsen and bluestone in the English countryside, maybe 5,000 years old. They feel impossibly ancient, relics from a time we can barely grasp.
But what if I told you that those iconic structures are practically newborns? What if I told you that 12,000 years ago, a staggering 7,000 years before the first stones were laid at Stonehenge, something far more complex, far more ambitious, and infinitely more mysterious was already standing, fully formed, in the rugged hills of southeastern Turkey? We are going back to a time when humanity was supposed to be primitive, nomadic, scratching out a meager existence day by day. A time before pottery, before writing, and critically, before widespread agriculture. This is the Paleolithic mind, meeting the monumental scale of the future. This is Göbekli Tepe. And its very existence is the single greatest challenge to the narrative of human history we have ever uncovered. For an entire hour, we are going to decode the impossible. We are going to look into the eyes of the hunter-gatherers who accomplished what traditional archaeology insisted was impossible.
We are going to try and answer the two most fundamental questions about this miraculous place. Who built it? And why, after centuries of use, did they choose to deliberately bury it, sealing their sacred world away from the future? Before we dive into the deep end of the past, I have a quick request for you, my fellow explorers. If you find yourself captivated by these ancient mysteries, if you feel that thrilling chill of historical discovery, then please take a moment right now, hit that like button, share this video with someone else who loves history, and of course, subscribe to the channel.
And most importantly, make sure you activate the bell button for notifications for our new videos, so you never miss another journey into the unknown. We are building a community of curious minds, and your support is what keeps these deep dives coming. Now, let's engage the history-shattering question of the day. We are talking about a civilization that built massive stone temples before they learned to farm. This completely flips the script. The accepted wisdom, the Neolithic Revolution theory, states that humans first settled down to farm, creating agricultural surplus, which then allowed for specialization, social hierarchy, and eventually monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite. Perhaps they gathered and settled first to build the temple, and agriculture followed as a necessity to feed the builders. So, here is your question for the comments below. If the impulse to build and worship came before the need to farm, what does that tell us about the fundamental nature of early humanity? Were we driven by spiritual need or physical necessity? Drop your thoughts down below. I read every single one of your insightful theories. The story of Göbekli Tepe starts, as so many great archaeological stories do, with an accidental discovery and a quiet, persistent man. In the 1960s, a survey team briefly examined the site, dismissing the low, oddly shaped hills as nothing more than a medieval cemetery. They were wrong, terribly wrong. The site sat dormant until 1994, when the late German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, a man with an intuition for the truly ancient, decided to take a second look. What Schmidt found wasn't a burial ground. It was a massive artificial mound, a tell, covering layer upon layer of sophisticated architecture. He recognized almost immediately that the broken stone fragments scattered across the surface were not random rocks, but the very tops of colossal, highly stylized pillars. Imagine the scene: a high plateau, windswept and barren today, overlooking the vast plains of Anatolia. Schmidt and his team began to dig, and what emerged from the earth was a series of massive, circular enclosures, designated A, B, C, and D, and now many more. These enclosures are defined by monolithic T-shaped pillars. These pillars, my friends, are the heart of the mystery.
They are carved from local limestone, and they stand between 10 and 20 feet tall. Some of the largest weigh up to 20 metric tons. That's roughly 40,000 pounds. To put this in perspective, these pillars were quarried, shaped, and moved without the aid of metal tools, without the wheel, and without domesticated draft animals.
This required organized labor, advanced planning, and sophisticated engineering knowledge on a scale that should not have existed 12 millennia ago. The T-shape itself is fascinating. It's not just a support structure. It's anthropomorphic. The narrow top of the T represents a stylized head, while the long shaft represents a body. Many of the pillars feature carved arms that sweep around the sides, often meeting at a belt or loincloth carved in relief near the base. They are stone people, standing shoulder to shoulder, facing inward toward the center of the circle. Enclosure D is perhaps the most famous, the spiritual epicenter of the site. It features two enormous T-pillars standing sentinel at its center, surrounded by a circle of 12 smaller pillars. The floor within these circles was not earth. It was polished terrazzo, a kind of concrete made from burnt lime, highly advanced for the era. The entire space was clearly designed for ritual, for gathering, for deep spiritual practice. But the carvings on the pillars are where the Stone Age mind truly comes alive. Göbekli Tepe is a zoo carved in stone, a vibrant, terrifying representation of the prehistoric world. We see dangerous animals depicted in stunning, high relief. snarling wild boars, aggressive aurochs, the ancestor of modern cattle, lions, foxes, and most prominently, snakes and vultures. These are not cute pastoral scenes. They are powerful, often predatory creatures. They speak of a world where survival was a daily struggle, where the line between life and death was thin. The vulture is particularly resonant. In many ancient cultures, the vulture is associated with death, transition, and the movement of the soul. Some archaeologists theorize that Göbekli Tepe might have been a center for sky burial, where the deceased were exposed to the elements and the scavengers, a common practice among early societies. And these carved vultures stand as silent witnesses to those rituals. Beyond the animals, there are abstract symbols, H shapes, V shapes, crosses, and crescents, symbols we still haven't fully decoded. They form a complex, pre-literate language, conveying information or cosmology that is now lost to time. These are the earliest known examples of complex narrative art anywhere on Earth. What we are looking at is not a simple campsite. It's not a village where people lived. It's a monumental, dedicated ritual complex, built by people who traveled, gathered, and worshipped here, long before they decided to permanently settle down in one place.
This is the key distinction. Traditional archaeology says settlement led to surplus. Surplus led to temples. Göbekli Tepe forces us to consider that the need for a shared spiritual center, a place to gather, exchange ideas, and perform rituals, might have been the initial spark that drove large-scale cooperation and, eventually, the need for stable food sources nearby. The construction of these massive circles would have required hundreds, perhaps thousands of people. They needed to be fed, housed temporarily, and organized. This scale of organization implies a sophisticated social structure, leadership, and perhaps even a specialized priestly class, long before the supposed invention of these societal structures.
The very act of building Göbekli Tepe may have been the catalyst for the invention of agriculture. Think about it. If you are gathering hundreds of workers to move 40,000-pound stones, you cannot rely on the inconsistent yields of wild foraging. You need a stable, nearby food source. And what do we find in the regions surrounding Göbekli Tepe? This is the very heart of the Fertile Crescent, the genetic homeland of einkorn wheat, the earliest domesticated grain. The pressure to feed the builders of this immense temple complex may have been the driving force behind the domestication of wheat, not the other way around. The temple came first. The farm followed. Belief drove necessity. As we move through the timeline, the mystery deepens. Göbekli Tepe was not built all at once. It was used, modified, and expanded for perhaps 1,000 years, maybe more. But around 8,000 BCE, the construction abruptly ceased. And this where the story takes its most confounding turn. They didn't just abandon it. They systematically
meticulously and deliberately buried it. Imagine the effort involved. These people who had spent generations quarrying and erecting 20-ton megaliths now spent generations hauling millions of cubic feet of earth, stones, and rubble to completely seal the entire complex. They filled the circles up to the T-tops, effectively entombing their sacred architecture. This wasn't erosion. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was a sustained, intentional act of preservation, or perhaps termination.
Why? The theories are profound and unsettling. One theory suggests that the religious or social function of the site had simply run its course. Perhaps the cosmology changed, or the specific rituals performed there were no longer relevant to the evolving society. By burying it, they weren't destroying it. They were honoring it and preserving it for the ancestors, ensuring that its sanctity remained untouched by the new world order they were creating. Another, more dramatic theory ties the burial directly to massive climate change. Around 8,200 years ago, the world experienced the 8.2 kiloyear event, a sharp global cooling period that drastically altered environmental conditions. If the hunter-gatherer lifestyle became unsustainable, or if the spiritual message of the site seemed ineffective against the changing climate, perhaps the priests or leaders decided to seal the temple, believing they had angered the gods, or that the era of monumental worship had ended. However, the most compelling theory suggests that the act of burial was itself a final, profound ritual. It was the ultimate sacrifice, the sealing of the past to inaugurate the future. A future that involved settled agriculture, larger villages, and the beginnings of what we recognize as true Neolithic society. They sealed away the wild, nomadic, hunter-gatherer soul of their people to embrace the stability of the farming life. The layers of fill material used to bury the site are complex. They contain broken tools, animal bones, evidence of feasting, and fragments of human debris, suggesting that the burial process itself was a long, ceremonial event, a slow process of farewell. They didn't walk away. They decommissioned their cathedral with reverence. When Klaus Schmidt first uncovered these T-pillars, standing silently in their ancient grave, he knew he wasn't just looking at old stones. He was looking at the moment history fractured. He was looking at the moment the human spirit demanded organization, not for survival alone, but for worship. This realization fundamentally shifts our understanding of the human story. It suggests that culture, the shared need for meaning, for ritual, for connection to the divine, was the primary engine of civilization, preceding and driving technological innovation like agriculture. We didn't build temples because we had surplus food. We created surplus food so we could build temples. Tonight, as we continue this journey through the next hour, we are going to explore the specific cosmology represented by those terrifying animal carvings. We will investigate the compelling evidence of early feasting and large-scale beer production found at the site. And we will look at the other newly discovered sites in the region, Karahan Tepe and Navali Chori, which proved that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated anomaly, but the pinnacle of a widespread, sophisticated pre-Neolithic culture that existed across this region 12,000 years ago.
Stick with me. We are just beginning to scratch the surface of the world before history began. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it is rewriting our origin story. We've established the when and the where, hitting the PPNA period, the very dawn of the Neolithic Revolution. But now we need to talk about what they built, because the architectural complexity here is so detailed, so deliberate, it smashes every assumption we had about the capabilities of hunter-gatherers. Look at the centerpiece of Göbekli Tepe, the T-shaped pillars. These aren't just big stones. They are megaliths weighing up to 20 tons, towering 5.5 meters high, and they are the key to unlocking the minds of these 12,000-year-old builders. The prevailing theory, championed by the late Klaus Schmidt, is that these pillars are highly stylized anthropomorphic representations. They are people.
Specifically, powerful or divine beings, perhaps ancestors or deities. If you look closely at the broader faces of the T, you can see relief carvings that clearly depict arms bent at the elbow, hands resting on the abdomen, sometimes even clutching a loincloth or a foxpelt belt. This isn't abstract art. This is monumental representation of figures central to their cosmology, figures that stand silent guard over the sacred space. These figures are imposing, silent, and surrounded by a zoo of deeply symbolic animals. We're talking about massive enclosures designated A, B, C, and D, each with its own pair of central pillars staring across the circular space. And plastered all over these pillars and the surrounding enclosure walls are creatures that seem ripped straight from a shared dream or a terrifying mythology. We see boars, ducks, bucrania, and crucially, a heavy emphasis on predatory animals: scorpions, lions, leopards, and vultures. The sheer ferocity of the iconography suggests that these weren't just hunting camps. This was a place where the spiritual and the primal met head-on, where the dangers of the wild world were acknowledged, worshipped, or perhaps appeased. One of the most enigmatic carvings is the famous vulture stone in enclosure D. This stone, Pillar 43, is a narrative in rock. It depicts a headless human figure, perhaps suggesting a ritual sacrifice or death, surrounded by these terrifying birds of prey. This scene, combined with the presence of deeply carved snakes and scorpions, speaks to a culture that had a profound and possibly frightening concept of the afterlife or the journey of the soul. Below the main vulture, we see a representation that some researchers believe might be the earliest known depiction of a constellation, perhaps Orion or Taurus, or maybe even a map of a celestial catastrophe. If that interpretation is correct, then these hunter-gatherers weren't just building temples, They were mapping the cosmos, embedding astronomical and possibly historical celestial knowledge into the very foundations of their sacred spaces. And if you are already blown away by the sophistication of this art and engineering, do me a favor right now and smash that like button and share this video with anyone who still thinks history started with the pyramids. We need to get this information out there. Now, let's talk logistics. How do you get 20-ton pillars carved out of limestone bedrock and transported maybe a quarter of a mile, then erected, without draft animals, without the wheel, and without a centralized agricultural government? You need coordination, manpower, and a compelling reason for hundreds of people to drop everything and work together. The answer, increasingly, points to ritual feasting and, yes, massive amounts of beer. Archaeologists have found huge stone troughs, some holding over 160 liters, that show clear evidence of fermentation residue, oxalates, the telltale sign of brewing grain mash. This wasn't homebrew for a small family gathering. This was industrial-scale production of a low-alcohol, high-calorie beer, likely thick and nutritious, used specifically for these massive communal events. Think about the psychology here. Göbekli Tepe wasn't a residential site. There are no substantial permanent houses. It was a pilgrimage center, a ritual nexus. People gathered here intermittently, perhaps seasonally, for funerals, rites of passage, or astronomical events. And when they gathered, they needed to bond, to celebrate, and to work. The feasting provided the social cement. Imagine hundreds of hunter-gatherers who usually operate in small, egalitarian bands coming together. You need a mechanism to smooth over potential conflicts and establish temporary leadership or hierarchical organization necessary for moving those massive stones. Beer, meat from the thousands of wild animal bones found, and shared ritual provided that mechanism. It was the ultimate ancient team-building exercise, motivated by spiritual urgency. This flips the traditional narrative on its head. For decades, we believed agriculture led to surplus, which led to settlement, which led to large-scale organization, and then maybe temples. Göbekli Tepe suggests the reverse, the need for a monumental, sacred space, the temple, was so powerful that it compelled hunter-gatherers to organize, coordinate labor, develop specialized production, like brewing, and ultimately might have been the crucial catalyst for the very first experiments in deliberate cultivation. They needed the grain for the party, for the ritual, not just for daily survival. What do you guys think? Is the desire for spiritual connection and a good buzz a more powerful driver of civilization than simple necessity? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's leave Göbekli Tepe for a moment and travel about 35 miles south to a site that is, frankly, just as mind-boggling, and in some ways, even larger. Karahan Tepe. When Göbekli Tepe was first discovered, it was treated as a singular miracle. Karahan Tepe, proves it was a movement. Excavations here, ramping up dramatically in the last few years, show a site with similar T-pillars, similar circular enclosures, but with a few key differences that deepen the mystery of this entire culture.
First, the scale. Karahan Tepe has thousands of T-pillars still visible in the ground, suggesting a footprint potentially larger and certainly more dense than Göbekli Tepe. It seems to have been active concurrently, or perhaps even slightly earlier, pushing the timeline of monumental construction even further back into deep prehistory.
But the real shocker at Karahan Tepe is the shift in focus towards the human form, often in deeply explicit and unsettling ways. We have the famous Chamber of the Heads, a deeply carved, bench-lined subterranean room where a row of 9 stylized, snake-like heads protrude from the wall. They are menacing, hypnotic, and clearly tied to some deep, esoteric ritual, involving perhaps water or fertility, given the subsequent discoveries. And then there is the incredible discovery of the massive central figure found in the main T-pillar enclosure, known as the Pillar Hall. It is a male human torso, carved in exquisite detail, sitting on a bench. It is headless, but the detail of the musculature and the explicit phallic symbolism is undeniable.
This isn't just a stylized representation. This is a powerful, explicit depiction of a masculine deity or ancestor, a figure of tremendous power. This connection to explicit human representation links Karahan Tepe back to the famous Urfa man statue, discovered nearby decades ago, the oldest known life-sized human sculpture in the world, dating back to around 9000 BC. These sites, taken together, show a culture obsessed with monumentalizing both the animal kingdom at GT and the human.
Ancestral form. It raises the question, were these two sites complementary? Did one serve as a center for the animal cults, perhaps tied to hunting success or fertility, while the other focused on ancestral worship, power, and the transmission of knowledge? The complexity of this religious system is staggering, far beyond simple shamanism.
If you are getting value out of this deep dive, please make sure you hit that notification bell, because the next video is going to explore the astronomical alignments of these structures and the underground architecture of Karahan Tepe, and you do not want to miss that. Let's talk about Nevali Chori. Unfortunately, unlike the other two sites, Nevali Chori is now lost to time, submerged beneath the waters of the Ataturk Dam since 1992.
But before it was flooded, archaeologists managed to salvage incredible amounts of data, providing the crucial link in this cultural chain. Nevali Chori is slightly later than Göbekli Tepe, dating primarily to the PPNB period, around 8500 BC. This site shows the transition.
While Göbekli Tepe was purely a ritual center, Nevali Chori was a fully settled village. People lived there year-round, cultivating early forms of domesticated cereals. But here's the kicker. Right in the center of their permanent village, they built a ritual structure featuring, you guessed it, T-pillars.
They were smaller, less monumental than those at Göbekli Tepe, but the architectural continuity is undeniable. What does this tell us? It tells us that the hunter-gatherers who built the massive temporary temples at Göbekli Tepe didn't just vanish. As the climate stabilized after the initial shock of the Younger Dryas, they began to settle down, but they took their spiritual architecture with them. The grand public temples transitioned into smaller, integrated shrines within the domestic space. The sacred geometry of the T-pillar enclosures became a permanent part of their newly sedentary lives. This is the moment we see the merging of the sacred and the mundane. The people who were once nomadic pilgrims coming together for massive feasts and construction projects were now farmers, integrating their ancient rituals into the structure of their daily villages. Navali Chori is the archaeological proof that the spiritual impetus of Göbekli Tepe preceded and drove the establishment of permanent settlements and the adoption of agriculture in this region. We have established that Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe were the pinnacle of a stunningly sophisticated pre-agricultural culture. But perhaps the greatest mystery, the one that keeps archaeologists up at night, is not how they built it, but why they stopped. Around 8000 BC, the entire monumental complex at Göbekli Tepe was deliberately, systematically buried.
We're talking about filling the enclosures with thousands of cubic meters of rubble, limestone fragments, and tool debris. This wasn't natural erosion. This was a massive, organized effort to put the temple to sleep. Why?
The timing is crucial. This cultural phase, the PPNA, ends right around the time the world was recovering from one of the most abrupt and catastrophic climate shifts in recent history, the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was a sudden return to near glacial conditions that lasted for over 1,000 years, brutally interrupting the warm interglacial period.
It caused widespread drought and resource stress across the Fertile Crescent. Some researchers, looking specifically at the Vulture Stone, Pillar 43, we discussed earlier, have proposed a radical theory. The carvings are not just cosmological, but they are a record of a catastrophic event, a comet impact or an airburst event that occurred around 10,800 BC, triggering the Younger Dryas itself. The symbols, the scorpions, the headless man, the descending objects, are interpreted as a sky map recording the devastation.
While the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is still heavily debated, what is undeniable is that the environment changed drastically. The abundance of wild resources that supported the massive feasting culture likely vanished or shifted. The prevailing theory is that the builders of Göbekli Tepe, facing environmental collapse, decided that their spiritual centers were either failing to appease the gods, or perhaps the nature of the crisis demanded a complete cultural reset. They ritually decommissioned their greatest achievement, burying the mighty temples like a time capsule for future generations to find. It was a conscious decision to end the age of monumental hunter-gatherer temples and shift toward a new way of life, a life centered around domesticity and ultimately agriculture. They didn't abandon their religion. They transitioned it into the villages of the PPNB, like Nevali Chori. This burial act is perhaps the most profound statement this culture made. We built the greatest temple the world had ever seen, and now we are closing the door on that era forever. If you are finding this material fascinating, make sure you share this video with your history teachers, because this is the stuff they aren't teaching in school yet. Let's circle back to the biggest implication of Göbekli Tepe, its relationship with the Neolithic Revolution. Before these discoveries, the standard model held that agriculture was an inevitable, rational response to population pressure or resource scarcity. Göbekli Tepe suggests it was a cultural choice, possibly driven by ritual necessity. The site sits right in the core area where the wild ancestors of our key domesticated species originated. The wild forms of einkorn wheat, barley, and rye, as well as the wild ancestors of sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle, were all abundant in the hills surrounding this region 12,000 years ago. This area is the very birthplace of farming. So we have the raw materials, and we have the motive, the need for massive quantities of grain for ritual beer production. Imagine the shift. Initially, the people are gathering wild einkorn, a difficult and labor-intensive process. As their ritual needs grew, they started protecting the most productive patches, perhaps scattering seeds near the temple to ensure a reliable supply for the next great feast. This wasn't subsistence farming. This was ritual cultivation. Over generations, this protection and selective harvesting led to genetic changes. The grain stalks became tougher. The seeds stopped shattering easily, the key trait of domestication. Suddenly, they realized they had created a reliable food source that could support permanent settlement. The temple, built for the gods, inadvertently paved the way for the farm, built for survival. The discovery of sites like Çatalhöyük, the massive Neolithic town that flourished thousands of years later, can now be seen not as a spontaneous invention, but as the direct cultural descendant of the T-pillar builders. The sophisticated social organization, the shared ritual spaces, the mastery of construction, it all has its roots in the massive coordinated efforts required to raise those 20-ton limestone pillars at Göbekli Tepe. This is why Göbekli Tepe isn't just an archaeological curiosity. It is the missing link. It shows us that the impulse for organized religion and monumental architecture may have been the very thing that forced humanity out of its hunter-gatherer lifestyle and onto the path of civilization. We are talking about a civilization that existed entirely outside the timeline we thought possible. A complex society that mastered engineering, art, and cosmology, all before the concept of a permanent home was even widespread. But wait, we need to dive deeper into the engineering itself. How did they move these stones? We know they were quarried from the surrounding limestone plateau, In fact, archaeologists have found the quarry pits where the T-pillars were cut, and even better, they found a pillar still partially attached to the bedrock, massive in scale, waiting to be transported. The precision of the carving, especially the low relief work depicting the animals, suggests not just skill, but specialized labor.
This wasn't something every hunter-gatherer did in his spare time. This required master stonemasons, people dedicated solely to the craft of monumental sculpture. This implies a level of societal stratification and resource allocation that we previously thought impossible for this era.
And the tools? They were using stone tools, flint, obsidian, and chert. Imagine carving fine details into hard limestone with nothing but another, harder piece of stone.
The sheer volume of labor required for every single pillar is astronomical. It confirms that the commitment to building these temples was the single most important project for this entire regional culture. Now, let's talk about the bizarre underground architecture at Karahan Tepe, because this is where things get truly mysterious, and perhaps even a little creepy. Unlike Göbekli Tepe, which is built on the surface of a mound, Karahan Tepe features extensive subterranean complexes. We are talking about chambers carved directly into the bedrock, connected by tunnels and sophisticated water channels. In the pillar hall at Karahan Tepe, where that massive headless human statue sits, there is a complex system of carved channels. Some researchers believe this was used for drainage, but others suggest a ritual purpose, perhaps relating to the movement of water, or, more strangely, blood or other liquids used in ceremony. Adding to the mystery, archaeologists have recently uncovered a network of rock-cut tunnels at Karahan Tepe that seem to lead deep underground, connecting various structures. These tunnels are often too narrow to walk upright, suggesting they were used for specific ritual purposes, perhaps initiations or solitary confinement, rather than simple transportation. And within these subterranean spaces, the art focuses intensely on snakes and abstract, repeating geometric patterns. If Göbekli Tepe was the public temple of the sky and the hunt, Karahan Tepe feels like the secret, initiatory space of the earth and the underworld. What kind of belief system required such an elaborate duality? A public temple for feasting and monumental display, and a secret subterranean complex for initiatory rites and communion with the chthonic powers. It suggests a priesthood or a specialized ritual class that controlled access to certain sacred knowledge, another hallmark of complex society that we thought developed much later. Let me know in the comments if you think the tunnels were for ritual or just practical drainage. I'm genuinely curious what you guys think about the underground secrets of Karahan Tepe. And we must not overlook the trade networks. While the pillars are local limestone, the tools used to carve them, the flint and especially the obsidian, were not. Obsidian is volcanic glass, incredibly sharp and essential for fine carving. The nearest sources of high-quality obsidian are hundreds of miles away in central Anatolia and eastern Turkey. This means that 12,000 years ago, before widespread settlement, there were established long-distance trade routes connecting these ritual centers to resource hubs across the region. Hunter-gatherer bands weren't isolated, they were interconnected, exchanging valuable goods, and likely exchanging knowledge and ritual practices. This trade network is the infrastructure that allowed the PPNA culture to flourish. It ensures that the ideas, the T-pillar motif, the animal iconography, the astronomical observations, were not confined to one hilltop, but spread across dozens of sites, creating a unified cultural sphere. And this unified cultural sphere is precisely why the discovery of these other sites, Karahan Tepe, Nevali Chori, and now others like Sayborç and Sefer Tepe, is so critical. They prove Göbekli Tepe wasn't an accident of genius. It was the expression of a shared, sophisticated ideology that dominated the upper Mesopotamian region for millennia. Consider Sayborç. Discovered even more recently, Sayborç features a carved panel that is absolutely astonishing. Now, Sayborç is small compared to Göbekli Tepe or Karahan Tepe, but its contribution to our understanding is immense because of this single piece of art. What does it show? It's a narrative scene, which is incredibly rare for this period. We see a man, depicted frontally, sitting down. He's flanked by two leopards, which are absolutely massive and facing him.
But here's the kicker. The man is holding his phallus, which is shaped like a snake, or perhaps it is a snake wrapped around it. This isn't just an animal relief, guys. This is a complex symbolic tableau. It screams ritual, fertility, power, and perhaps even the control of wild forces.
It tells us that these people weren't just carving cool pictures of bulls and foxes. They were documenting their mythology, their spiritual struggles, and their understanding of gender and creation. And Sayborç is dated to about 9000 BC, putting it squarely in the time frame alongside the earliest phases of Göbekli Tepe. It's yet another piece of proof that this shared iconography, leopards, snakes, powerful male figures, was the common language of this Neolithic spiritual elite.
What do you think that panel means? Is it a depiction of a shaman performing a rite? Is it a creation myth? Drop your theories in the comments below, because this is the kind of puzzle that keeps archaeologists up at night. Karahan Tepe, the labyrinth of secrets. But if Göbekli Tepe is the famous flagship, then Karahan Tepe is the sprawling, monumental hidden city that is only now being fully uncovered. And trust me, it's mind-blowing.
Karahan Tepe, located about 35 kilometers east of Şanlıurfa, is often referred to as the sister site to Göbekli Tepe, but recent discoveries suggest it might be even larger and potentially even older in some of its earliest phases. It shares the characteristic T-shaped pillars, but the sheer density and the unique features here push the boundaries of what we thought was possible for hunter-gatherers. while Göbekli Tepe is characterized by circular enclosures built into the hillside. Karahan Tepe features deep bedrock-cut complexes. They literally carved massive halls out of the natural rock formation. We're talking about an unbelievable amount of labor. The most famous discovery at Karahan Tepe, and the one that gets everyone talking, is the Pillar Hall, or the Hall of the Phalluses. This complex features 11 colossal T-pillars, many of which are broken, but the centerpiece is utterly unique. A row of 12 meticulously carved human heads emerging from the bedrock, staring forward. These heads are strikingly realistic, not stylized like the T-pillars, and they have pronounced, almost scowling features. And right in front of these heads, carved into the floor, is an array of phallic symbols, some standing nearly a meter tall. Now, put that imagery together. You have 12 intense, almost intimidating carved human faces, likely representing ancestors, deities, or powerful figures, overseeing a ritual space dominated by symbols of male fertility and power. This isn't just decoration. This is a deeply serious, perhaps intimidating, ritual landscape. It suggests a powerful, perhaps hierarchical society that was highly focused on lineage, reproduction, and the transition between life and death. The scale of Karahan Tepe implies a massive population capable of organizing and sustaining this work over centuries. We're talking about thousands of tons of stone moved and shaped, all without metal tools, without domesticated animals for heavy lifting, and without the infrastructure of settled agriculture. It makes you realize that the traditional model, that agriculture led to settled life, which led to surplus, which led to monumental architecture, is completely upside down here. At Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, it appears that the need for monumental religious centers drove the social complexity. The ritual came first, and the necessity of feeding the workforce perhaps provided the initial spark for intentional plant cultivation nearby. The mystery of the missing people. We talk a lot about the stones and the carvings, but who were the people who created this stunning cultural explosion? We know they were highly skilled hunter-gatherers. The analysis of animal bones at these sites shows they hunted gazelles, wild sheep, and aurochs, the massive wild ancestors of modern cattle. They were masters of their environment. They utilized wild grains, pulses, and nuts. But here's the problem. We find very few human remains at Göbekli Tepe or Karahan Tepe. They are ritual centers, not burial grounds in the typical sense. However, there is evidence of unusual mortuary practices. At Göbekli Tepe, fragments of human skulls have been found bearing deliberate cuts and carvings. This isn't evidence of violent death. It's evidence of post-mortem manipulation, perhaps excarnation, defleshing, or ritual display of the skull. This points towards a complex system of ancestor veneration, or perhaps the ritual management of the deceased, where the skull, the seat of identity and memory, was separated and perhaps displayed or reinterred in a separate, sacred context. This is a practice seen in later Neolithic cultures, but finding it here, at the very dawn of settled life, is astonishing. The people of this unified cultural sphere weren't just building temples. They were redefining what it meant to be human, what it meant to die, and what the relationship was between the living and the spirits of the past. If you're finding this deep dive into prehistory fascinating, do me a massive favor and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video, where we dive into the catastrophic events that may have ended this era. Seriously, the algorithms are tricky, and you don't want to miss the big reveal. The feasting hypothesis, sustaining the work. How did they manage to feed the thousands of people needed to build and maintain these massive complexes? This is where the feasting hypothesis comes in, and it's one of the most compelling explanations for the organizational genius of the PPNA, pre-pottery Neolithic period. Archaeologists have found evidence of massive, industrial-scale preparation of food and drink. At Göbekli Tepe, for example, they found huge stone vats carved into the bedrock, large enough to hold significant quantities of liquid, likely beer or some form of fermented beverage made from wild grains. The sheer volume of animal remains found at these sites, particularly the bones of aurochs and gazelle, indicates massive, periodic slaughter events. These weren't daily meals. These were colossal feasts. The theory suggests that these sites were not permanently occupied cities, but rather pilgrimage centers. Different tribes or extended family groups from across the upper Mesopotamian region would converge periodically, perhaps seasonally or maybe once every few years, to participate in rituals, construct new enclosures, reinforce social ties, and, critically, feast. The ability to host a massive feast was a sign of prestige and power. If you could coordinate the hunt, gather the wild grains, and brew enough beer to sustain hundreds or thousands of people for weeks of ritual work, you held immense social capital. These feasts were the glue that held this vast, unified cultural sphere together. They were the original social networking events, cementing alliances through shared labor and shared consumption.
And remember, the wild grains found here are the ancestors of domesticated wheat. The intensive gathering and processing of these wild cereals for brewing and feasting may have been the very first step toward domestication. They weren't domesticating wheat to feed a settled village. They were domesticating wheat to throw better, bigger parties for the gods and the ancestors.
The role of shamanism and symbolism. Let's look closer at the symbolism, because it is the key to unlocking their cosmology. Every carving is deliberate, and they repeat across dozens of sites. The vulture is perhaps the most enigmatic and important animal in this iconography. Vultures appear frequently, sometimes shown with detached human heads or limbs. This strongly reinforces the idea of excarnation, allowing vultures to strip the flesh from the dead, a practice known from later Neolithic societies in the region. The vulture, therefore, may have been the messenger or guide carrying the soul of the deceased up to the heavens, or perhaps symbolizing the cycle of death and renewal. The fox is another common figure, often depicted with an aggressive, almost sly demeanor. The fox might represent cunning, agility, or perhaps a trickster figure in their mythology. But it's the combination of these symbols, the vulture, the snake, the leopard, and the auroch, that creates a coherent narrative. These are not merely random animals. They represent the key elements of their world: the sky, vulture; the earth, leopard; auroch and the underworld, fertility, phallus. If you look at the famous T-pillars, they are not just pillars, they are stylized human figures. They have arms carved on the side, and sometimes they wear belts or loincloths. These T-pillars are the key players in the ritual space, the silent, towering witnesses to the sacred events, perhaps representing deities or powerful ancestors. They stand in the center, overlooking the feasting and the rituals of life and death. This level of symbolic complexity suggests that the people of Göbekli Tepe possessed a rich oral tradition, a massive, intricate mythology that explained the universe, their place in it, and the proper way to conduct rituals. We are staring at the physical remnants of a massive pre-literate religious epic. The Great Burial. Why did they stop? Now we come to the most profound mystery of all, the abandonment. Around 8200 BC, the entire cultural sphere, Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Nevali Chori, and the rest, began to shut down. But they didn't just walk away. They intentionally buried their sacred centers. This wasn't a gradual accumulation of dust and debris. Archaeological evidence shows that the monumental enclosures were deliberately filled with thousands of cubic meters of earth, rubble, broken stones, and domestic refuse. It was a massive, coordinated effort to entomb the temples. Why would a culture that poured so much energy, time, and spiritual devotion into these sites spend even more energy burying them? Hypothesis 1. Environmental catastrophe. There is strong geological evidence for a severe, rapid climate change event, known as the 8K. 2 kiloyear event, or 8.2K event. This was a sudden, massive cold and dry period that dramatically impacted the climate across the northern hemisphere, causing widespread drought in the Fertile Crescent. If the lifeblood of their society, the wild grains and the herds of gazelle, suddenly failed due to prolonged drought, the foundations of their feasting culture would collapse. The rituals, designed to ensure abundance and fertility, would appear to have failed. If the gods stopped delivering, the temples might have lost their sacred power. Hypothesis 2. Ideological revolution. The very success of the ritual centers led to their demise. As the population grew and the need for food intensified, the local communities began shifting from relying purely on wild resources to fully domesticated agriculture. The realization that sophisticated ideology and monumental architecture preceded agriculture forces us to completely rewrite the first chapter of human history. We are no longer talking about simple, superstitious cavemen slowly learning to farm. We are talking about complex, spiritually driven people who organized themselves on a scale previously reserved for the pharaohs and the Sumerian kings, and they did it 6,000 years earlier.